Russia has been making headlines around the world, and tonight we take a closer look at strained tensions that are shaping foreign relations. The United States is not the only country suspicious of Russia's interference in elections. We spoke to experts about international meddling in democratic systems. And as international involvement in Syria escalates, we examine the key players and stakes in the conflict. The Current International starts now. Hello and welcome to the Current International. I'm Ryan Thompson. Relations between Russia and the West have reached a new low, a low point that some say is reminiscent of the Cold War. More on that later. But already strained relations have deteriorated even further after the apparent poisoning of a former Russian spy living in the UK in March. Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were hospitalized after what British authorities say was an attack by a nerve agent. In the weeks after, a wave of hawkish diplomacy followed, with the UK expelling Russian diplomats, Russia expelling UK diplomats, and a resulting spillover that impacted UK allies Germany and the United States and their diplomatic relations with Russia. Correspondent Dan Toomey has more on that poisoning and how it sparked a war of words between Russia and the West.
Thanks, Ryan. On March 4th, Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were brought to the hospital after being found unconscious in the English town of Salisbury. Investigators from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons say the Skripals were exposed to the nerve agent Novichok. This is a poison believed to have been produced by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, while little is known about the source of the poison that infected the Skripals, Prime Minister Theresa May condemned the Russian government for sponsoring the attacks on UK soil.
Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. We will not tolerate such a brazen attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil. We must now stand ready to take much more extensive measures.
Now, since that address, the UK has employed sanctions on Russia, and Russian delegates have been expelled from the US and across Europe. Russia has defended itself on the basis that no one knows exactly where the poison came from. So we spoke with one professor who believes the blame still falls on Russia, despite the uncertainties surrounding the case.
In the post-Soviet era, the Russian intelligence agencies have shown themselves willing to operate abroad, including through poisoning. Novichok obviously did not kill either Skripal or his daughter and was traceable. So you do have to wonder about some of the descriptors of it. These sorts of agents have to be done very carefully in highly controlled conditions because otherwise they kill the people developing them. In this case, we don't know who was at the Skripal's house there, and it would have to be someone extremely well-trained. But yeah, I mean, I think it's 98% likelihood that it was the Russian government, and specifically the GRU, the military intelligence.
Yulia Skripal was released from the hospital earlier this month. Her father, meanwhile, is recovering while in the hospital.
We've heard a lot about Russia influencing the elections in the U.S. But what about in other countries? So there are several countries in Latin America, and they have elections coming up. So if you go to maybe Mexico, we have Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil. They're all having presidential elections. But one expert I spoke to doesn't think this is an area of interest for Russia.
Doesn't have pretensions to any great influence in Latin America. Of course they try to encourage good relations, and when you have a country like Venezuela that has gone so sharply in the socialist direction, Russia has stronger ties there than they might have elsewhere. But on the whole, they have no pretensions to building some kind of base of influence.
That was Robert English. He is a professor at the University of Southern California. While Latin American countries are not a hotspot for Russia, Professor English says Russia is interested in influencing politics in other parts of the world.
China, however, is a different matter, because China has so many, such huge economic investments and economic leverage there. Russia, very little. Where Russia has also meddled in elections and, as I say, experimented in supporting certain candidates and parties is in Western Europe, right?
The U.S. intelligence community says Russia tried to influence the U.S. election in 2016 using cyber espionage, online intrusions of state electoral boards, and propaganda. An investigation led by Robert Mueller that links the Trump campaign to Russia is still underway. But several experts have pointed out that the U.S. has also tried to swing elections in other countries.
We do spend a considerable amount of effort in our pro-democracy efforts to support candidates or movements or parties that are clearly against against Putin, that would shift allies into adversaries all around the former Soviet Union. And in Putin's eyes, our doing that is no different morally from him messing around through the internet and social media in our elections.
Professor Dov Levin, a scholar at Carnegie Mellon, analyzed Russian and American political interventions between 1946 to 2000. He found that the U.S. worked to influence elections in Japan, in Chile, and Israel. And on the other hand, Russia has tried to make an impact on elections in Western Germany, in France, and India. Both countries have tried to interfere in Italy. So this raises the question, why has there been so much criticism against Russia in the most recent U.S. presidential election?
The Russian intervention in the 2016 U.S. election was not meant to be public. That is, we know about it and it was exposed inadvertently. That is, if it was up to Vladimir Putin, we would have never known from where those documents that were hacked from the DNC came from.
Now let's send it over to our reporter, Dan Toomey. Earlier this week, he spoke to a person who helped spread fake news on the internet.
Vitali Belov is a Russian journalist who allegedly produced fake news articles for a Russian media outlet called the Internet Research Agency. We have him in the studio today. Vitali, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you too.
So my first question for you is, how did you first join the Internet Research Agency?
Ну, вообще, когда я пришел туда, на
When I came for the interview, I didn't understand what the agency was and what it was doing. But in several days of work, and 2 to 3 days of work, I understood where I was working because it became pretty evident.
работы, 2-3 дня работы, я понял, где я нахожусь. Просто как бы это стало...
I decided I would stay there, not because I shared their principles. I have a completely different point of view on politics. But I decided to stay and make my role an investigation and make it public. The investigation was not pre-planned. I did not plan it. It just happened by chance.
Оно произошло случайно.
Is this still going on? Are people still writing fake news for these Russian media outlets?
Сейчас это то, что я знаю точно, да? Сейчас до сих пор...
Right now, what I know for sure is that there are several Russian sites that are controlled by an agency, Fake Ukraine.
Существует Fake Ukraine сайт.
There used to be more than one of those sites. As to American departments, it is so secretive that I have no idea what it does or how big it is.
То его работа держится под таким большим секретом, что я даже не представляю его масштабы и то, чем он занимается.
Have you read the press coverage about the IRA from other media outlets, and do you believe the press coverage about the IRA is accurate?
Я понимаю обеспокоенность американских журналистов.
I understand the worries about the American public and journalists, but it seems to me that Putin is more dangerous than investigations show.
Гораздо опаснее, чем агентство американцев.
Now, fake news from foreign outlets, however, can hit closer to home. I have TN Alok here with me, whose own article was picked out by a false media outlet. Tiana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
really
for having
appreciate it. So, walk us through your story. It started with an article, and where did it go from there?
I mean, it was quite banal. It was, I was around the USC area. I saw a sign that said no black people allowed. So I went up more as a citizen than as a journalist just to go find, I talked to the owner of the home, and it became immediately clear, and then I confirmed with DPS that it was actually an African-American neighbor who had gone into a tiff with the neighbors who had put up the sign in retaliation.
And he was the one who put, okay.
So it was clearly a hate crime hoax, really a disagreement between two neighbors. I confirmed it with DPS, wrote up a very quick news story. It got maybe 5,000 hits. It was by no means a big story for us for that month. And so then I was surprised to see within 24 hours, this account on Facebook called Blacktivist, which had positioned itself as a sort of just social justice, Black Lives Matter activist account, not an actual journalistic outlet. But the way that they had done it, they'd taken the photo of the sign that I'd put up, and they had repackaged it with their watermark and with the words hate hoax. And the story that was included in the caption was basically alleging that white USC students had done this and that USC was this racial war zone. And so I commented on their fake news. Of course, at that point, the way Facebook's algorithm especially worked at the time was that time was of the essence. So the fact that I hadn't picked it up immediately meant that it got thousands of likes, thousands of engagements.
On Facebook, it got thousands.
Facebook,
and
yes.
that's fairly significant for Facebook.
Yeah, for Facebook, certainly.
Yeah.
And so I remember I tweeted about it, and I mean, Facebook is a void, so there's not really anything, there was not much more to do. It wasn't that Facebook was going to take it seriously. I had already had a problem with fake news distribution on Facebook.
Sure.
And Facebook was always very unreceptive. And so then in October, when I saw the alert that Blacktivist, the account, had been a Russian bot, it kind of immediately made sense, because it's easy for us to think about these sort of diamond and silk adjacent pro-Trump bots, because that sort of was what the open interest of Russian interference was.
But that doesn't tell the whole story, does it? Yeah.
I mean, it is more about sowing dissent than it was about anything. And an account like that acting like this relatively publicly white, wealthy college is this racial war zone serves into the interest of Russian dissidents who wish to sow dissent in, American society.
Sure. Yeah. It's attacking it at both ends, which I think is so fascinating that people don't necessarily think, no, they're operating on both ends of the spectrum. Do you trust social media now? Are you a little more cautious now when because now that you've seen it firsthand, you as not only a social media consumer but also as a news writer, are you more cautious?
Yes, I mean, I've always been a big social media skeptic, so it's not terribly uncommon for me to not trust things that I see in image macros. But I do think that it goes to show if a piece of information is sent to you without a link, if it's not sent to you without any shred of evidence. And I mean, even today I saw this tweet being shared around. Everyone was sharing it. How all the Kardashians and Jenners unfollowed Kanye West on Twitter. And I just went back and I was like, I'm just curious. I checked. They didn't. They also are still following him. But it goes to show how if you can just package something into a tweet that can be easily shared, or package something into a Facebook image, so you can't even Google search the text because Facebook makes it so difficult for individual posts to be reverse searched on Google. It just makes it so easy to distribute information. So I guess, it does come down to individual American citizens being more discriminate about how they consume their news.
Absolutely, and of course, urging caution from wise words. Now, as Russia is accused of creating fake media, the freedom of press is put into question. Our reporter Tara Ruff has more.
According to a study done by Freedom House, a U.S.-funded NGO, Russia's press freedom status is considered not free. That means Russia's political rights and civil liberties ranked low on a national scale. Human Rights Watch says that since Vladimir Putin resumed the office of presidency in 2012, Russian authorities have intensified a crackdown on freedom of speech. The expert we spoke to said this is not a coincidence.
If a news channel, if a program, if a news magazine consistently publishes stuff that irritates the government, that seems to contradict or blame the government, then they will probably experience some kind of pressure. It could be financial pressure. They could discover their license is suspended. They could discover that they're subject to health inspections or tax investigations, or they could even find some top people transferred or fired. The reporters and the editors know if they cross the line, they'll get in trouble. So they generally don't cross the line.
According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there have been 82 journalists and media workers killed in Russia between 1992 and 2018. Among them was Anna Politkovskaya, a world-renowned journalist known for her reports on human rights abuses by the Russian military in Chechnya. Elena Milashina continued those investigations into Chechnya. Milashina now works from a remote location after death threats pushed her out of Russia. Even with a decline in the murder rate of journalists since 2014, English believes the message is still clear.
You don't have to kill in large numbers, but just the occasional beating, and there are many more beatings or other brutal treatment. People getting fired, people who lose their bank account, people who discover the complete identity theft that drains their account or that ends their career. short of beating or killing. For every one of those, 100 journalists get the message. You don't have to enforce it for everyone.
English said Russian authorities encourage the idea that the Western media is also corrupt, giving the perception that their own media isn't as bad despite all of this. He believes with the new wave of advocacy from millennials, the state of press freedom in Russia could improve in the future.
The Cold War never actually amounted to direct confrontation between the United States and its Soviet enemies. But what did take place were a number of less talked about proxy wars. In other words, foreign conflicts with the US on one side and Soviet Russia on the other. To name just a few, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Ethiopian Civil War, and the Nicaraguan Civil War. But there were dozens of even lesser known conflicts, and all had the same goal: for the two powers to retain influence. The Soviet Union is long gone, but the fight for Russian influence is still very much alive today, particularly in Syria. Take a look at recent comments by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
In Syria, we see confrontations and proxy wars involving several national armies, a number of armed opposition groups, many national and international militia, foreign fighters from everywhere in the world, and various terrorist organizations. The Cold War is back with a vengeance.
The Cold War is back with a vengeance. Serious words from the UN chief, and many columnists, NGOs, and other diplomats have come to the same conclusion, including journalist Janine DiGiovanni. In a recent New York Times column, she warned that pulling 2,000 U.S. troops from Syria would create a vacuum for Iran and Russia. That was before a coalition of airstrikes by the U.S., France, and the U.K., which will affect Russia's influence in the region, but how exactly remains to be seen. And that's it for the Current International. On behalf of all of our incredibly dedicated and hardworking team, we thank you for tuning in. It's been a pleasure sharing stories from around the world. You can find more international headlines on our website, uscannenbergmedia.com.